Welcome, everybody. My name's David Wood, and welcome to London Futurists. Today, we're going to be anticipating the Paris AI Action Summit, which is something taking place fairly early in February with multiple world leaders, politicians, business people, leaders of pressure groups, citizens groups, NGOs, all discussing what should be done to ensure a good future of AI. Well, there's an AI drawn picture here, but I'm going to ask you not to look too closely at the picture. It's just an AI's fantasy. We're going to look at the real picture, which I think is this. It's an action summit because it's to work out what actions should be taken to promote potentially a very good future for everybody with AI, and at the same time actions to avoid significant harms. And I have suggested to the panelists today that they will consider perhaps up to 4 questions, although they may have other things which they want to put on the table as well. And the 4 questions briefly are: how do we prevent a potentially dangerous escalating arms race in which different companies or different geopolitical blocs are determined not to be left behind and therefore cut corners increasingly as regards safety and fairness and justice? So how do we avoid that from spiraling into an unsatisfactory or even a very dangerous outcome? More generally, what system of governance should be put in place, not just for today's relatively narrow AIs, which are already powerful, capable in many ways, but in the reasonably near future, there'll be AIs, likely, with much more general reasoning capabilities, with much greater power. Is today's governance systems enough, or do we need a significant change in them? Let's discuss that. Now, there are some people who say we don't particularly need to put governance systems in place because AI is likely by itself to achieve a great, good outcome. But in that case, I would ask such people, well, what would you be worried about? Just in case, are there signs, and here I call them canary signals, of things going worse than you expected? So this is question 3, what are the potential canary signals of a forthcoming abrupt catastrophic transition? Can we agree them in advance? And in that case, what contingency measures should we have prepared? A bit like having some fire extinguishers dotted around the place so that if there is a signs of fire, we can spray that nasty foam everywhere. And it's not very nice to have that nice, nasty foam, but it's far better than being burned alive. So can we prepare some contingency measures for canary signals? And then to come back from the theoretical discussions to the practical actions that each of us might take, what can we do now or in the near future, either as individuals, each in our individual circumstance, or collectively? Because after all, we are potentially much stronger joined up. What can we do to steer the development and deployment of AI in truly positive ways? So we're going to be hearing some opening remarks from each of 3 fascinating speakers. You're going to hear first from Dan Faggella, who is the founder and CEO of Emerge Artificial Intelligence Research. If you're not following Dan on social media already, you absolutely should. He posts a whole bunch of fascinating things about the worthy successor and many other ideas. You should likewise be following Jerome Glenn, our second panelist. He is the founder and the executive director of the Millennium Project, a worldwide network of nodes which are collectively studying many of the same questions we are going to be discussing today. And third, we're going to be hearing from Patty O'Callaghan, who is the technical director of Charles River Laboratories, but also is a member of the Google Developers Advisory Board. So that's all I want to say about that just now. We'll come back to some more later. But Dan, the floor is yours. What would you like to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to touch on each of the 4 questions here, David, and in some cases, just share a little bit about what I'm seeing within the AI policy ecosystem and the people that I speak to there, OECD, United Nations, whatever. and also the business world, and kind of how that's changed some of my perspective on a few of these questions. And in a few cases, I might even dot kind of some questions on the table that I think will be worth maybe more discourse here, or maybe more discourse, at the Paris event or leading up to it. So I'll try to touch on all four, and at least lay out what I think is relevant as of now, and might be useful for the conversation. So with respect to the first conversation, or the first question around preventing dangerous escalation, I mean, it seems, in my opinion, it seems patently self-evident that some degree of hard and enforceable governance is the only name of the game here. There is still a lot of discourse, particularly on social media, about, Sam Altman is bad or evil, or, this Dario guy, he said he was going to do AI for good, and now they're partnering with Palantir, and can you believe it? OMG. In my opinion, we ought simply accept that the people closest to birthing the sand god are just going to go pedal to the metal and try to get there, because if they don't, they're going to be consumed by somebody else's. And I don't, we could decide if we want to moralize it about it or not, but I think the moralizing discussion almost suggests that if there were a more virtuous and saintly person running OpenAI, then surely globally we would all be slowing down and calibrating towards a better human and post-human future, and all would be well. And what I'm suggesting is that that's actually not the case at all. I'm suggesting that only sort of an enforceable governance would be sort of the name of the game. So I'm a little bit leery of, as we get closer and closer to the finish line, more and more banging on the table about, Altman being particularly evil or Dario being particularly evil. I'm not going to call the guy a saint. I'm not going to call the guy a devil. I'm just going to say, I think it's cool that robust and mature governments build resilient systems that can endure devils and saints at the helm, and can continue. And that's because there's hard governance and there's structure in place. So I think that's the only answer. I'm seeing a lot of movement towards, moral table banging, particularly in kind of the Twitter sphere. And it doesn't seem nearly as productive as sort of working towards what we can do to get to governance. And I'll get a little bit into that in the next question here. I think to sort of preview that a little bit, I mean, increasingly of the belief that, always have been on some level, but increasingly of the belief that sort of getting the US and China on the same page is really the name of the game. It's not necessarily getting every country that's ever existed to sort of think AGI is a risk. It's really getting the administrations that are running those two particularly large and significant countries to sort of say, to both come to a conclusion that probably a brute military and tech arms race to conjure a sand god that we don't understand and almost certainly won't be able to control is probably a net ill for both of us. Like, we don't agree, but let's agree on that, and then let's kind of tamper things down and sort of figure out how we want to work forward. The US and China is the name of the game. There's a lot of folks, Jan Tallinn recently in a set of emails back and forth sort of expressed his take here to me as well, where it's sort of like, hey, like, what seems to matter now is sort of influencing the Trump administration on some level. And so the Trump administration and China feel like the big game. I'm still involved in the intergovernmental world, but I sort of feel like that's the big game at this point, is getting that conclusion to be drawn, getting every Tom, Dick, and Harry, getting getting Tunisia and Peru on board. Not, there might be some value there, but I think the big crescendo is the big players. The second question is sort of how to establish an effective governance system and transitioning from narrow to strong AI. This is something Jerome has drawn a really great distinction on over the years. The UN often has not made the distinction between those two, sort of presuming that AI is this eternal narrow tool as opposed to an increasingly hyper capable, an increasingly embodied sort of system that is exhibiting traits that are increasingly agentic, and sort of having its own ability to wield and execute in the world. There's an interesting report by the Center for International Governance Innovation, which is in Canada. David, you had Andrea Miotti on with the Narrow Path, which is kind of like an interesting structure and outline, and I think it's a worthwhile place to start. I like Andrea's ideas. The CIGI, again, Center for International Governance Innovation, they have kind of an AGI governance report. One of the lead authors there is a guy named Duncan Casbeggs. I could probably dig up the link and throw it in the chat after I'm done yapping here. But they do a pretty good job, in my opinion, of sort of outlining what are some of the things that could be relevant now, assuming like that AI doesn't boom and take off very rapidly, but what would sort of happen after it does cross certain thresholds. Duncan, who's one of the main authors there, brings up a great point, which I don't hear spoken about very often. A lot of the time, the resistance to governance for this stuff is, hey, you want to build some big authoritarian cabal when like this technology is never going to have its own agenda. This technology is never going to wake up and magically be super powerful. It's a freaking toaster oven. We push a button, we tell it what to do. It's like a glorified cell phone. No matter how far it gets, it's always going to be there. And so Duncan brings up a brilliant point, which I think should be part of the discourse, which is that let's let that camp and hey, maybe they're right. I don't know. Who the hell knows? You know, like I have no clue, right? But maybe they're right. Let's give that camp credence and have sort of governance structures and agreements in place where it's like, okay, if that be the case and these existing thresholds sort of are just never crossed, then cool. This kind of coordination globally, or this kind of limitation on certain kinds of tech and open source, or whatever the case may be, just will never kick in, right? We'll come up with kind of a plan of like what would happen if that occurred, but it'll just never kick in. Because it'll stay a toaster oven for all of eternity, which I think some people, including remarkably intelligent people, are just remarkably convinced of. And so I think we've got to sort of allow that camp to have that take, but say, great, great, great. And I know you think it's probably sci-fi, but if it ever did, wouldn't it be smart if we X? And so CIGI, Duncan's report, I think they address that pretty well. Again, what does it look like to sort of get such an agreement crossed? I really think it's the great powers. Recently, you know, there's been a lot of this alignment with the big labs and the military. So OpenAI and Palantir and like, you know, Anthropic and Anduril and whatever. And these are sort of the new digital AI oriented. They're trying to become the new primes, right? The new digital primes for the military. Lots of money there. There's this sort of change in flavor of Silicon Valley. It used to be like military bad, and now it's sort of like wokeness bad. And so, you know, they're kind of rolling with the wind here, and sort of right now the wind is going in the flavor of like masculine military stuff is cool. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying it's the cultural milieu, right? Zuckerberg's playing into it, doing kind of whatever it takes to kind of ride the current wave. Trump's coming into office. Why not just get on board and kind of be one of the boys? There's a lot of that. But also, it is the case that not everybody in the military is hell-bent on let's just build the sand god and destroy China. Jack Shanahan, who used to run the JAIC, which is the Joint AI sort of commission for the Department of Defense for years, sort of the guy that kicked that thing off, recently just had like a 2-hour conversation with Jack, which will be live on the podcast, the Trajectory podcast, in a maybe a month and a half. And he's hell-bent on making sure that the US stays strong and stays ahead on AI, but is just as hell-bent on ensuring there's as much conversation going on with China as possible, as much common ground as possible, and as much emphasis on avoiding mistakes and tragedies in an arms race as we go. And I don't think he was very clear. He's not the only guy in the DoD that feels that way. If China also has leaders in that capacity that sort of feel that way, I think forging, you know, grabbing those quotes, and, you know, he's a huge advocate for kind of track 2 conversation, forging that kind of discourse in track 2, and allowing the people that think it's always going to be a toaster oven to sort of have certain things never kick off if it stays a toaster oven, I think is sort of the name of the game. So for the second question, that's kind of how I feel here. And I'll just zip my way down to the fourth question, David, and then wrap up. I want to make sure everybody else gets to say their piece. We mentioned kind of the practical steps concerned citizens can take. I'm somewhat concerned here that even at the level of track 2 and getting the US and China and finding people like Shanahan who, like, I think mostly get it, at least in my opinion, to communicate. I think even those early dialogues may not happen in any ardent degree until something smacks us in the face. And this is the really, really hard part about this. And I'll put something in the chat. I'll make sure it's kind of linked in for everybody. There's a longer article on this. You don't have to read it. But there's this idea about sort of disasters being maybe necessary to unite us. That's not something I hope for, by the way. I'm not sitting here like, oh, I can't wait for the disaster so we all get along. I think that's a ridiculous opinion. That said, like, I do wonder at times if we need to be slapped real hard across the face in order to sort of garner some sort of shared interest in dealing with this problem. And I think the issue with challenges is that there's kind of two kinds fundamentally. There's an infographic in the chat for anybody bored enough to want to read it. The basic idea is there are disasters that I think would actually accelerate the arms race, and there are disasters that I think would slow it down. So a disaster around AI that was interpreted by one of the great powers as, on some level, an intentional marshaled effort by the other great power to harm them would almost certainly accentuate arms race dynamics. So if it was human against human wielding this AI tool, or if it was interpreted that way, maybe that wasn't even the case, but it was interpreted that way, perception, then I think that would accelerate an arms race. And so I do not believe all disasters would garner coordination. However, if the disaster that occurred was somewhat clearly, at least perceived by both great powers as this is something doing its own thing. This was not humans doing this against this group of humans, or this group of humans doing something to this group of humans. This was something doing its own thing, or some rogue group in Sudan, or some rogue group in Pakistan, whatever the case may be, an arbitrary smaller nation. If it came from some rogue wacko group, or if it came from AI itself, I think that would bring the great powers to unite. So the basic idea with disasters is this, and I don't think this is talked about enough. And I have one last thing I'll say and I'll wrap up. But the thing I don't think is talked about enough is when or if some kind of an AI disaster occurred, the great powers look at each other and they say one of two things. One thing is, why the hell did you do that? That's accelerating the arms race. The second thing they could say is they could look at each other and say, how are we going to deal with this? That's decelerating the arms race. And so how the initial disaster is interpreted, I think, would determine whether or not we're accelerating or decelerating the arms race dynamics. And I think people often say disaster equals we get on the same page. I don't agree. I think it's very, very particular flavors of disasters and perceptions and interpretations of disasters that would do that. The final thing I'll mention here with regards to what can an average citizen do is sort of more of a little bit of a question. Again, I think influencing the US and China is kind of the biggest name of the game there, anything that can move us in that direction. I wonder if disasters is what we're going to need. There is a question right now around whether we should be discussing difficult futures now. So if you talk to a Dan Hendricks, or you talk to a Connor Leahy, or you talk to a Yudkowsky, and I've had hour and a half, 2 hour conversations with each of these men, you will often get a overt shoving to the side of the conversation of what happens if we get this right. So like, okay, cool. So let's just say AI, like, oh, we just like magic, like we align it or whatever, right? What does that look like? Like that conversation is shoved to the side because I think the perception sometimes in the AI safety world is that that discourse would divide people. Hey, let's all just unite around not dying, and then we'll talk about the future later. I can see the credence to that point, but I personally suspect, and maybe this group will have opinions, that obfuscating the fact that life is still going to change really radically, even if this goes well, like we're not going back to the 1950s or something, or like freezing 2025 forever. Like that's not the future we're headed towards. I think being frank about like how would life pretty fundamentally transform, assuming we control this, or we wield this in whatever way people want, or align it in whatever way people want, and sort of discussing the preferable and non-preferable panoplies of futures that we could arrive at if we get it right. I think that's somewhat ubiquitously interpreted as a bad thing and not to be discussed by the common parlance of AGI safety. And I sort of wonder if maybe we ought look at the hard futures ahead and maybe think about the preferable versions of it and see if we can make more of a uniting effort around those things. These are just things I'm seeing in the wind. Right now, there's a lot of obfuscation, and that's kind of that. So that's all I've got to say, David.
Fantastic. Many thanks for kicking us off. I do notice a few questions in the chat window, and one of them I'll put to you straight away. Dan, it's from Lavran Make. who says that the AI they interact with can't even answer the question, what are names of all the states in America? If AI still makes so many mistakes, what are we doing talking about AGI? What's your answer? That AGI may come soon, or that even if AI can't answer all the questions, it's still going to change everything and be tremendously disruptive?
Yeah, so my suspicion is twofold here. So first and foremost, I think it's patently obvious that we're not necessarily at AGI right now. But second, I think all you really have to do, this is just a personal opinion, right? Like my work day to day is like interviewing head of AI Raytheon, chief innovation officer, Goldman Sachs, over like a decade. And if you just look at like what's being used and what AI is capable of, there is a sort of trajectory line here. So it's like, I think everybody here remembers when AI could make really cool and interesting pictures, but it would give humans 7 fingers instead of 5 on each hand, or like weird things like that, right? And that was surely a sign that sort of obviously, and pretty much for eternity, AI would never actually do art. But that was like a 3-month thing, you know what I mean? And then like we just went over it and then like that's over. I remember when Go was one of those eternal barriers. And so I suspect that sort of most of these things are just going to get steamrolled. And the majority of the sort of like, ha ha ha, this will never be AGI stuff that I see comes from oftentimes folks who have computer science backgrounds who were not a part of the large language model wave and kind of want to shame it. Or folks who would prefer that the world not change all that radically. So I suspect like any of the smaller barriers are likely to get steamrolled. And I suspect that even with AI as it is, assuming it never garners agency, it never garners volition, even AI as it is, Gen AI as it is, would represent very, very radical and serious changes to the human condition in terms of like immersive Gen AI experiences, in terms of like what education, entertainment, relationships look like. I think fundamentally, if you just freeze the tech now and you grow a 5-year-old into a 25-year-old, I think their lives are way more alien than our lives are compared to someone born in like 1720. And so I suspect that talking seriously about change is warranted regardless, but I also suspect we're headed towards much more powerful systems regardless as well.
Super.
Yep.
There are already 6 great questions in the Q&A window. We'll get to them shortly. I will tend to prioritize the questions that have got the most upvotes. So the one at the top just now, by the way, is asking us, well, what about the disruptions to employment? Well, we'll come to that shortly. Jerome, what would you like to say? The floor is yours.
Well, I'd like to say that futurists are supposed to look at a range of possibilities. And so rather than saying this will be or that will be, we're saying here's a bunch of possibilities. And a responsible futurist, in my judgment, should look at what do you do about these different possibilities. During the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, beginning of the 90s, we thought it was possible to have thermonuclear war with the Soviet Union. And we put a lot of effort into figuring out how to prevent that. It didn't happen. The nuclear war didn't happen. But maybe because of all of our efforts, it didn't happen. But maybe if we didn't have all those efforts, we might not be here today. Secondly, I think, Dan mentioned this a bit, and I'll stress it, because it really is not sinking in yet. We have to talk about AI as if it is not one thing. And I am tired of people saying things like, well, AI is this. They say, no, we're going to lose control. Blah, blah, blah. Well, these are different AIs. The narrow, weak AI, what we got right now, is not what we're worried about, except information warfare and destroying its democracy. Other than that, but the one we're really worried about is what happens if you have the future general intelligence that then grows into a super intelligence beyond our control. And so to me, the way we cover our bets, so to speak, is take a look at how we go from narrow to general. I'll make an analogy here. A young child, you are in charge. You tell it when to go to sleep, what to wear, what to eat. You're in charge. And when you're a teen, and that's sort of like narrow intelligence right now. You're telling it what to do. General is a little more like a teenager in the sense, yeah, you've got some control, but you think you actually turn out you have less control than you thought you did, and you're gonna experiment a little bit. They're gonna have purple hair, but you know you're still okay. General is like the adult. You know, you're not in charge anymore. Now, a responsible parent knows that how you shape that adult later on is the going from the child to the teenager. That's where you can shape the character and all of that of a child. That's where we are with AI now. And I would ask people listening to this, try to make the distinction between, are you talking about narrow? Are you talking about general? Or are you talking about super? Because what you do about those things and what they imply and all that are quite different. It's like saying IT, information technology, is the fax machine and it's the internet. Well, the fax machine's quite a lot different than the internet, but they're both IT. And it's that kind of confused conversation we have in the world. So we got to clean up the conversation and get some distinctions. That's one thing. The second is I did get a phone call from the Chinese embassy here in Washington, D.C., the science attaché, asking about our artificial general intelligence study. And one of the things we talked about was the arms race and stuff like that Dan mentioned. And their view was they would like to do a joint program, a joint governance, joint resolutions, joint you name it, with the United States. And that was repeated more than once. Now, maybe they want to do that because they want to get some intelligence. I don't know. But in any case, that's the position. And they feel that the United States is not willing to cooperate. Because you do have senators in recent hearings saying the United States has got to be in charge, which is not exactly the same thing as a joint organization. I believe that the Financial Times last year did say that there have been some secret meetings. There have been public meetings between the United States and China. There's also been some secret meetings. I am hoping that they're beginning to do the military implications and treaty eventually. Because just like Dan pointed out, when both the Soviet Union and the United States both said, wait a minute, this nuclear arms race can get out of hand, get out of control, and we're both gone. So it's in the interest of both of us to figure out how to manage it. The weapons were still classified, the spying was still, all that stuff was still going on, but we created the negotiations that have capped the nuclear weapons and brought them down between the United States and the Soviet Union. I think the United States and China has got to do the same thing. Where do the individual come into this? A variety of ways. One, you can contact your local legislature and say, start working on a licensing system for AGI. It's going to take you a while to get it done. It's going to be a while before it's here. So you got to start now. Also, contact your Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ask your Ministry of Foreign Affairs to have a UN General Assembly session on AGI. We all know that the world has got to have a conversation. And I think the most efficient time to impact way to do this is a General Assembly, because this asks each country to say, what is your position on AGI? And make it specifically AGI, not just narrow, because we've got 2 UN resolutions that have been passed on narrow. We've got laws in China on narrow. We've got the European Union on narrow. We've got the European Council Treaty that you can sign now on narrow, but we don't have anything on general. So if you are going to contact your foreign ministry, say a General Assembly session on general, artificial general intelligence, not just the narrow stuff. You want to have another one on that? That's fine. But I've been in these things where people want to talk about general, and they come back to narrow all the time. They're not staying at this one. Now, when somebody says, well, the AI is not, getting the states right, that's like saying, well, your child, is pooping in his pants. He's never going to get to Harvard. Well, things grow up. And it goes back to the original point. It's the job of the future to look at possibilities. We're not saying what will happen. We're saying, here's a bunch of possibilities, and we should look at them. Now, I'm not asking everybody to look at them in the great detail. I mean, we've done a study on this sort of stuff, which, by the way, you can get on our website, Millennium Project, if you want. It's a State of the Future report. It's got 200 pages on this sort of stuff. But you can simply ask your legislators and your ministries of foreign affairs, get on this, start to look at it, and don't give me narrow intelligence. That's in play. Millions of people around the world are working on it. I am not upset with that. The UNESCO values and all this sort of stuff, it's going on great, but we got to focus up here. And if we don't, we back into it, then we have to pray that it works out okay. Because once General gets going well enough, I don't think you can really control it going into super. So I would rather, but stick with the analogy of the arms race in nuclear war. We prevented this. I was involved in it. Some of you know a little bit, and it was generally believed at that time that nuclear war was inevitable. I'm not kidding. I mean, younger people don't realize this, but most people thought it was a matter of time. Why? Because when two or more great powers confront themselves, they usually inevitably use the weapons, most advanced weapons of the day. Right? Well, by that piece of history rule, we should have had thermonuclear war. We didn't. There's people like Jeffrey Hinton and Connor, you mentioned, and I agree with them, that it may be impossible to manage this before it occurs. This is like anticipatory governance. You're governing something before it's there. It may be impossible, but I think we have to try. And that was the attitude during the Cold War, and here we are. We're still alive.
Many thanks, Jerome. Lots to think about there. The questions are continuing to grow. We will come to them shortly, but first I'd like to hear from Patty O'Callaghan. What would you like to hope that will be discussed in Paris?
Great. Thank you, David. And I was taking a lot of notes while Dan and Jerome were talking, and really raising very, very important topics that I would like to cover one by one. And I put together some small presentation because, of course, Jerome and Dan, they have such an amazing trajectory of working with governments and international organizations that I thought for a minute, what can I bring to the conversation? What value can I bring to the conversation? And I think that since the background that I have and the things that I do with the tech communities, I would like to bring for a minute to think about, to stop for a minute, and let's move our eyes to the citizens. Like, what is the people doing around AI? What are their feelings around the AI? What are their fears? And that can really, stopping for a second, can really give us more insights into what is that we really want to achieve with events like the UK summit, and then South Korea, and now Paris. So before going into the slides for a minute, I wanted to cover some of the topics that were mentioned by my fellow panelists. So first of all, a topic that I'm very passionate about, which is AGI. So this is the problem that I see with AGI at the moment, and it's a problem that has been around for a long time. And I think that we really need to agree in a definition of what is AGI, because depending on the sector, maybe as Dan mentioned, he mentioned Sam Altman, what OpenAI refers as AGI might not be the same kind of idea that Google might have. Actually, I will also share in the chat, there is a very interesting paper that Google DeepMind released last year, which is called, I believe it's Levels of AGI, where they actually did, they wrote down kind of a framework to evaluate if a particular AI system would be considered AGI or not. One thing that, and that idea came from one of the questions from the audience. I don't agree that we are going to get AGI out of LLMs. I do believe that, and that's why you see people say, LLMs can be dumb. They really can't answer this correctly, this particular question. And I think that we, at least on my perspective, and I would love to hear what Jerome, David, Dan have to say about it. AGI is not going to come from LLMs. LLMs are going to be critical piece of what AGI is going to come from, but we have to still think about nanotechnology and other areas that are really going to get together, and where we finally are going to be able to have computer systems that can really generalize the way humans do. And we cannot get that from LLMs. I believe that LLMs have, they do have a limit, and they will always have that limit. So it's like a collaboration between several different kind of technologies. That is what is going to bring us to AGI. So yes, I will share that link later. And something that really brought to my attention what Dan was saying about waiting for a disaster, right? And that ties up to what Jerome is saying about the nuclear weapons. Obviously, when the nuclear race started, and then we sadly, unfortunately, had to come and be witness of the destruction that a nuclear weapon can bring to a city, to a whole country. That's when everyone got that moment that Dan was referring to, like looking at each other. What is that we just did? What are we going to do to stop it? So I think it's a really nice thought exercise. What could be a disaster in AI? What could be that kind of disaster of that kind of level that the governments will stop, or people will stop and look at each other? What is that we just did? And sadly, that's the way humans behave. And sometimes we cannot just prepare for the future, and especially given the pace, the fast pace of innovation with AI, which is unprecedented. So before I share my slides, and it's a very anecdotic kind of presentation that I'm going to give. It's very short. I feel that everything right now is in hands of like the big players, right? And how these geopolitical forces, how the regulation, what is these efforts on regulation are really looking to achieve? Is it to make it easier for the big corporations to collaborate with governments? Are they really thinking about the people, that is being directly affected by AI, even though they don't even know that they're being that they're dealing with AI directly, and this whole mentality of, or at least the perception that some people might have, that behind all of these efforts on regulation, there is this mentality of the winner takes it all, right? And that kind of race that countries might have into, okay, I want to be the one controlling AI. I want to be the one controlling or leading the regulations efforts around the world. So I guess what I'm going to do is to share this. Again, what I want to do is bring the conversation for just a while into the impact that AI is having on people, and the things that, even though they might sound very simple, we really need to think about them as much as we can. So this is just a bunch of ideas that I wanted to share with you from my experience of talking with people in my everyday life. So I run a code club at my local school, so I talk about AI a lot with the students, with the young people, with the teachers. My husband is a medical doctor in the NHS, so I also am very curious of hearing what his colleagues at the hospital, they think about AI, how they use it. Of course, I have a lot of technical in-depth conversations at work, when I'm speaking at AI conferences all over the world as well. So I really feel very privileged to have the opportunity to have these casual conversations about AI in all these different environments. And I wanted to share with you the ideas that usually comes out of those conversations. So first of all, why is it important that these conversations about AI, they have to go beyond the tech bubble and policymakers? And it's really because obviously there are real life consequences of how AI is shaping the way healthcare, finance, many different areas are using this technology. Many people think that AI is just ChatGPT. They don't have, and I'm talking about people out of the tech bubble. They don't have a clear idea of how AI might be used to decide if they're going to get a loan or not, what are the impacts that AI can really have on their regular life. And then, as I saw in the chat in some of the questions, there is also a big anxiety around, okay, we're going to lose our jobs, there's going to be an economical impact. So what are we going to do? Are we really stopping for a second to find ways to educate people into this? I'm going to give a very brief anecdote that I found very weird. So I have a very deep phobia. It's an irrational phobia of planes. I have a fear of flying, and it's a very unpractical phobia to have. So I have tried everything, and one of the things that I tried, even though I'm very aware of the engineering marvel that is a plane, I tried hypnotherapy, and I really didn't want to go because it's hard for me to believe in that kind of therapist, but I gave my best to it. And when I was talking to the therapist, he wanted to learn about me, and we ended up talking about AI, of course, at some point. And then he told me that he had a patient, and that was last year. He had a patient that was a very famous YouTube, like a YouTube star, and that he had to start going to the hypnotherapy sessions because he had a very deep fear and phobia of AI, that it was affecting him so much that he couldn't sleep at night. And I was absolutely surprised by that. And I even told him, like, how come someone can be that scared of AI? It doesn't make any sense. And he told me, how come someone can be that scared of planes? And I was like, well, okay, he has a point, right? But for me, it was very surprising to see there are people that are feeling that affected by this very fast pace of innovation on AI, and they don't really understand. They read the news, AI is going to crash the economy. That was the fear of this particular person. AI is going to crash the economy. We're going to end up without jobs. So what are we going to do about educating people? And of course, then we have decision makers, and Dan can talk a little bit more about this. Often they're not technical, so how are they making informed decisions, informed choices? And I would like to hear your opinion on this, Dan, because it's a topic that when I talk with people, technical people, that are always mentioning that. How come are we bringing bureaucracy into something that needs to be resolved in the regulatory field so fast, right? So then when I talk about AI literacy, a lot of people say, well, this is just like the internet. People, they don't need to understand how the internet works. They don't need to understand about DNS or IP or whatever. But this is different because AI is making decisions. AI algorithms are making decisions, or are really impacting the way people is impacting people in many different ways in their lives. Just going very briefly to this, how generative AI is impacting organizations. I really remember when the internet came about, and some companies, they would say like, we're not gonna use the internet, we don't need it, it's too dangerous, and then they really paid a price for that. And I do see now a lot of companies like, okay, we don't want to use generative AI, it's forbidden, and then they have shadow AI, people using AI even though it's forbidden in their companies. And what that brings is they're not prepared about the risks. They don't know what the things they have to do to use it in a safely way. Safety innovation equals boring innovation. So that means, are we putting a break into innovation with bureaucracy? Do we really need to do it? I believe that we need to do it, but in which way that we don't slow down innovation too much. And then, of course, we have several races in AI. We have the software race. It's not just one AI race. We have the software race with big players, the hardware race, and the regulatory race. And the regulatory race is really lagging. And then there are several risks around it that we can discuss in any other session because of time. And another thing is when these companies are developing these big, let's say, products like ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude, whatever, what's the best approach that they should take? Should it be let's add the guardrails to deal with the threats after we release the products, or should we really take a proactive approach and start taking care of the safety issues, the ethical issues, bias mitigations, and so on? So I would really like to see that proactive approach instead of the reactive approach that we really is what we're seeing. And my last point is that the tech is the wild, wild west. And the analogy that I do is that being my husband a medical doctor, all the things that they have to follow with their career, he has to present his credentials and what he has been doing for a year to keep up his knowledge. And they have to follow really strict ethical frameworks, really strict frameworks around healthcare innovation. And the reality is that computer science, software engineering is kind of a wild, wild west. There are obviously organizations all around the world that might regulate depending on the country, but the thing is that you have a bunch of software companies releasing into production, releasing into the wild any kind of software without following a strict regulation in terms of how the software engineering practice is done. And I really think that this is a fundamental problem that we haven't tackled. And I will also like to hear your ideas on that. And that's me. There's some more slides, but I really wanted just to touch. These are the topics that regular people out of the tech industry, out of the regulatory frameworks or areas are discussing. And we also need to hear them, and we also need to take care of them. So yeah, that will be my whole point.
Many thanks. I'm going to give Dan and then Jerome and then Patty 2 minutes maximum each to respond to anything you've heard so far, and then we'll look at the questions. Dan.
So if you go to the intergovernmental world, literally you will drown, like you will not be able to breathe. You'll drown and just die floating and bloated in kind of inclusion and, privacy and making children safe and whatever, all that kind of stuff, all the day-to-day stuff. It's in there real good. It's already in there real good. So for me, the Action Summit should really be about artificial general intelligence and sort of the prevention of really grandiose risks. I think the reason AGI can't be talked about within the United Nations, and with almost no exceptions, even within the OECD, which is even less bureaucratically hampered than the UN, is often because the room is so full of sort of equity and inclusion narratives that sort of, if you talk about things that aren't like children in Zimbabwe having a bad day, if you talk about something other than that, that like you're a bad person. So for me, actually, like the equity stuff within the IGO world, right, the proper international policy world, literally pushes AGI concerns out of the room to the point to which I almost, it could almost be considered a net ill. I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about it, but I think it's sucked up the oxygen. I consider that bad. To Jerome's point, I think the arms race dynamic and the analogy with nukes is kind of an interesting one. I think there are a lot of differences with this dynamic, but I do think that, like, Jerome, I'm actually interested if there's been blog posts about what lessons were learned from that experience of the inevitability of conflict that eventually turned into not, and if there's a direct translation. Like, I think it'd be cool if you wrote about that, I'd read it. That's all I have to say. But I'd love to see if there could be more transitions, because I wasn't around for a lot of that stuff, but I think it'd be really, really cool to understand that. And that could be an inspiring narrative to sort of tamper down the bigger risks of the grandiose extinction stuff that we're facing right now. So those are the things that are kind of striking me right now, David. I know we only have 2 minutes.
Thanks. Jerome, replies, comments?
Seeing how the first and third took a little longer than I did, maybe I can get 2.5 minutes.
You are indeed.
Okay. I am involved up to my eyeballs on the one question on how do we actually create some international deal on this before we lose control. I can't go into detail because a lot of stuff hasn't been cleared yet, but there is a very serious move afoot to get an international set of meetings with the General Assembly on AGI specifically. It's going to need other people to come in and push it. But the idea is to push the US and China together into a feasibility study for what that international thing would look like. Probably it's been agreed to, by the way, it would be multi-stakeholder. Businesses would be in this one. This is a different deal. I mean, it's been agreed to already. Academics as well as countries. And that it might be a hybrid system. It's both human and AI. It's going to be a hybrid sort of an organization. Anyway, a lot of this stuff is detailed in the State of the Future report that I put in the website. I've also got a book coming out on this stuff in more detail in a few months. But I agree, it is a race to get this going, and we have to do a whole bunch of stuff simultaneously. We've got to get a UN convention on this thing. We've got to get a General Assembly on this thing. We've got to get a feasibility study on this thing. And there are countries already lining up to begin to, like, we'll host it. So it's further down the road than people really realize. And they understand it's a mad race. And if we do this, it'll be a piece of history, because international bureaucracies have never moved this fast on anything before. But on the other hand, we've never faced this kind of thing before. And that's why we want to have a General Assembly conversation, to have a global conversation, to wake everybody up around the world on this sort of stuff. And imagine if I'm, and Dan, wrong, that it's not going to happen for a long time. That's fine. But what happens if that long-term time is wrong? You know, you have to look at all your contingencies. You got to look at all the futures. You can't just simply say, oh my God, I made a mistake and civilization is gone. Oh, too bad. No, that's a dumb position. I think the responsible thing as I talked about raising the children, the responsible parent looks at the child to the teenager and gets involved with the teenager, gets involved in how it gets, who it talks to, what kind of sports it gets, you get involved. We have to get involved. Now, obviously not everybody, but the average citizen, if they don't want to do just one thing, is contact their government and say, begin to work on this. And I don't mean narrow, I mean general. Begin to work on it. We're not telling you what to do, just begin.
Jerome, let me feed in quickly a question from Tony Zarneski, which follows on from your enthusiasm about the UN. Tony says, how can we seriously consider the UN as the problem solver? Given that AI and AGI is advancing exponentially, we may have AGI in a few years, which is beyond our control. Can we really seriously expect the UN to move as quickly as is needed?
No, we can't expect it. That's why we got to be completely different in our approaches. I mean, I can't go into detail right now because this stuff's is still in motion at the moment. But I can tell. I mean, I wrote about AI 30 years ago in a book called Future Mind. So I'm been aware of this conversation. In 1 year, it has gone from we can't regulate this, it'll stop innovation, to, well, how's it possible to do it? In 1 year, that's a gigantic shift in global thought leader perceptions. I mean, and one thing great about Elon Musk is he has, more than most, said we got to regulate this on a global basis. And if not the UN, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? You're going to do it with the G20? I don't think so. You're going to do it with the G7? These are contributors. But if I'm down in Little Dominica and I got a tremendous thermal capability, I can make a massive energy producer and say, come on down here, organized crime. Let's do your AGI down here. So we got to have everybody involved in this sort of thing. It's not like nuclear in that sense. This is something that you can cut across, because you can initiate these things in different locations around the world. So it has to be the UN. And simply to say, well, they can't do it, well, then get out of the way and let those people who are going to give it a try. That's what we did during the Cold War. Those people that said, look, it may be impossible to stop it, but we got to try. So those that wanted to try, they won the day.
Thanks. Patty, do you have a couple of minutes of responses to what you've heard?
Just very, very quickly. My points were not at all about diversity and inclusion. It was more about what are the people, like the conversations and the questions that are happening in the, what we can call the civilian world, right? And in order to think about the future, I think that first, having a common understanding of what is really AGI, I still don't see that there is a consensus on it. So how can we prevent a negative outcome out of AGI if there is still so much confusion around it? And mostly to think about at every level on the implications that this very powerful technology, as it becomes more powerful every single day, what are the implications that we need to care about for the people, and then the communities, then country level, and then for the whole world. So I think it's important to see it from the mega big picture all the way into the how it affects regular life.
Jerome, follow-up?
Yeah. Years ago, this question of you can't deal with terrorism until you define it held up progress on the international basis for over 10 years. My attitude is, let's begin, and we'll worry about we'll rechange the method. The definitions have been changing, as you know, over the last several years anyway. So the idea of nailing down a definition, waiting until we do that, which would be years to get that agreement, probably years. So let's start. Those who want to work on definitions, let them work on definitions. Those who want to work on national licensing systems, work on national licensing systems. Those who want to do public education, do public education. Those that want to do international regulatory enforcement, we have so much work to do. The idea of saying, before we do X, we got to do this. We got to do all of them now. And we'll interact with all of them now. That's how we're going to get this thing done, if we get it done at all. We can't simply say we got to wait until we get this before we get that.
So how can you agree on what's the domain of the problem?
To start to call a meeting, like we were doing right now in Paris. All right, we don't have a distinction between narrow and general. Well, that's a good thing to start getting done, right? We don't. I mean, look at the terrorism stuff. We lost 10 years because of that position. If you say, well, how can we regulate? Well, when you get into regulations, you're going to get into definitions. You're going to redefine it as you go. You can't, we won't have one definition that everybody agrees with. It's not going to happen. You can have some general definitions and you can work on it and you can change it. But think of this as a complex, dynamic, adaptive system. Good old-fashioned futuristic concept. Think of it that way, rather than a hierarchical prioritization level kind of a management. It's got to be an adaptive, complex system across the board.
let's take some questions from the audience. I'm going to take the two top voted questions and give each of the three of you a chance to answer either or both. One is by Conrad Schumann, and I think he's essentially asking, my AI crashed the economy, or my AGI crashed the economy, a topic that's come up already. As he says, the people he talks to, going back to what the citizens as a whole say, they are concerned about the future of work. So how will AI change the future of work? Is it something we can take in our stride, although it will be a bit challenging, or is it going to be more disruptive than ever? So that's one of the questions I'm lobbing to you. And you can also consider the question by Robbie Fraser, who has a different scenario in mind, which is that AI will get so much out of control that any moral frameworks we try to program into it, it's going to circumvent them, that our attempts to hardwire things into it are going to be puny in comparison. So is there an option for us to program in core principles or alignment strategies that will ensure that it will be aligned with what we humans want? Dan, do you want to answer either of these or both?
Sure. I'll try to touch on the second one. There's different views of sort of like what values are. So often values are talked about in the context of AGI, even with folks like Yudkowsky. Although, I think he more than adequately describes how wildly difficult this is. It's often thought of as kind of like a magic moral module. So values are sort of, so think about it like this. There's the part of the dynamic system of something living that has to respond and survive and fucking, do the hard work of like non-death, which is like, actually like, it's pretty hard to be honest. So there's like the part of the entity that does that. And then there's values. And values are like happy, friendly things where there's like butterflies and puppy dogs. And like, and they sit sort of in this world, it's like a parallel universe, right? There's like the world where you have to survive and like not die. And then there's sort of magic moral stuff. And that morals they get slotted in and they kind of click in, and then they sort of sit on top of or behind sort of all the stuff that's complex and in the world. I happen to believe most likely values in humans are a manifestation of our attempt to not die. They're just an extension of the conatus, if we're going to use Spinozan terminology here. So they're just one more extrapolation. It's a way of kind of conveying and sharing certain agreed upon maybe ways of behaving and expecting between social mammals that sort of permits us collectively maybe to not perish. And that values are an extension of our non-death efforts. They're not a beaming into us of some sort of non-survival eternal goodness signal that comes from the clouds. My suspicion is that values are probably that latter thing, where they're just part of that survival milieu. And so that indeed, if we were to pretend to click in a moral module to AGI, it may not eternally adhere to those. That said, we don't really know how this works. So this is just a hypothesis. All I will put on the table is I personally suspect you are probably right, because I suspect most people talking about putting values into AI think that they can click in a way that is outside of sort of the survival real world needs and sort of milieu of the entity's activities. And so I think I'm undecided as to whether it's moral module or conatus, but I happen to think it's more conatus. I happen to think you're right, and I happen to hope that there's more discourse about that.
To follow up, Jan Hurwitz asks, don't we have the values already clarified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948? Isn't that a good starting point for this work? Or has it all been swept aside by changes in capabilities and technologies?
I'm on the IEEE AI governance organizational stuff. Almost all of what we do is precisely defining values so that a third-party auditor can know whether that is there or not. And the Declaration of Human Rights, that's the starting point. And then we've got the UNESCO stuff, we've got the OECD stuff. I mean, there's a lot of stuff's gone further on that. But I'd like to, if it's okay, to jump over to the economic question. Okay, all right. The Millennium Project did a 3-year study on that question, and so I can't summarize it too easily right now. And again, we looked at possibilities. Here's how it can go messed up. here's how it can be mixed, and here's how it can go well. One of the things I think is useful to say is people keep talking about, well, if we have all of our jobs gone, we won't have any ambition, we'll just, bore ourselves to death. Well, no. Humans, one of the common traits of all humanity, including squirrels, is curiosity. And when you have a basic income, which I figure we can't make it until about 2035, we've done some work on this. It takes a while, and we did alternatives on this. But the idea is that if you have your basic needs met, and your love and belongingness through social media and so forth, then according to Maslow, the next step is self-actualization. If you're freezing to death, you don't care about who you are. You got to get warm. But if you got all of that stuff taken care of, then your head's above water, so to speak, and says, who am I? What do I want to become? And that is much more of a driving force than greed on that point of beating the other guy out of the way. Because if I'm so busy being myself, connecting to markets worldwide, then why would I give you a hard time? So we could actually end up with a far more peaceful world as a result of AGI and eventually guaranteed income. That you have the AI taking care of the infrastructure of civilization so that we humans then can invent the great next chapter of life. I mean, we know the brain can do a lot more than we think so far. We know there's a lot of possibilities. I mean, there's a whole universe out there to mess with. I mean, there's a tremendous future we could have. But right now, we're still dealing with making sure the civilization works. And AGI will help that get done. So if that's true, then we can go to a self-employed, connecting to markets worldwide, a self-actualization economy, and humans can be more free to develop themselves. After all, the most successful people on the planet, when you ask them why, they always usually come up with the same answer. I followed my passion. Well, average people can't follow their passion because they don't have enough money to do that. They got to feed the children. But when you have the basics done, then you can start to talk about following your passion. And that could be a fabulous future for civilization.
Thanks.
Which, by the way, means that they're unemployed in the usual sense. So full unemployment is, we figure by 2050, you're still going to have about 1 billion people doing stuff with jobs and so. But the other 3 to 4 billion of these people will be able to go beyond this. And this is why we got to very quickly get education to say, we're not going to just teach you to fit in. We're going to teach you to understand yourself and explore yourself. That shift is not, Finland is the first country actually to take that on a bit.
Patty, anything to add on either of these questions?
In terms of the job loss, of course, with this new wave of really powerful technology, a lot of roles are changing, a lot of industries are changing. So yes, I believe that there are jobs and roles that are going to disappear, but again, there are new roles that are going to appear as well. We saw it during the Industrial Revolution. So we shouldn't be too worried about that. What we have to be mindful is to know about this technology and how to apply it into our everyday work. So that will be my best advice for people worrying about that particular topic.
We need to learn about AI, and we need to learn a lot about AI. So education about AI is perhaps the most important thing at all levels. Let's take 3 more questions, since there's 3 questions now equally tied at the top of the list, and you can pick either. One by Rohit Talwar, who asks, let's be serious, Trump 2 is coming on Monday. What can we actually do to influence Trump 2, and what do we think Trump 2's administration will do around the regulation and of AI and AGI? So that's the first one. Let's also take a question from Lavrin Make, who talks about the energy requirements of these new AI systems. There is an insane need, he says, to manage AI and data centers' energy consumption. Should we think this differently? Isn't it insane that many of the big tech companies are even going to restart nuclear power plants in order to get enough energy? And the final question in this group is also by Rohit, who's had 2 questions upvoted significantly. He's asking about, do we need a hard slap? the slap heard around the world, to refer to a comment in chat earlier. Rohit points out that if we look at what's triggered good action in the world of social media or climate change or pandemics, or even Russia invading Ukraine, the model is to generally wait for a hard slap. How might AI or AGI be different? Dan, you want to go first in one or more of these?
Yeah, I'll touch on a few maybe. So with regards to influencing sort of the Trump administration, I think some of the lifting here is going to be around examining sort of who's most around him and who's most influenceable. I think there are people that sort of do political influence for a living. I'm not one of them. I hope to learn a lot at the Paris event. But I suspect it really has to look at the nodes that are important in the network. So, you have David Sachs, who's talked a lot about existential risk of AGI in the last year or so, 6 months or so. You have Musk, who used to talk a lot about AGI, but now he's racing towards the sand god because he has two choices. One is to die by the hand of someone else's sand god. One is to build one of his own. So I hope Musk is still influenceable in the direction of sort of coordination. He certainly was in that camp when he was behind the 8 ball, but now that he spent, however many billion on his own sand god, maybe he doesn't want as much regulation because he wants to build the thing that devours us instead, which makes sense. That's how the incentives work. So Musk might be influenceable. Sachs, I think, is there's this increasing tech milieu bending in the direction of like regulation bad, like deregulated cool, like beat China good. And like some of those things make sense. None of them are evil sentiments, but there is a sort of general tech bent now in the sort of masculine cool kid accelerationist sort of energy, and that seems to be swirling around some of the people that are influencing Trump. So I don't know what it's going to look like to precisely move the needle there, but I think we need to look at nodes in the network and how to influence them individually and make this in their own self-interest, because that's the only reason people take actions. In terms of slap heard around the world, yeah, I mean, I suspect that's probably something that's necessary here. I mean, I kind of mentioned that from the beginning. I think potentially we would need some kind of disaster. In that article, which I've put in the comments a bunch of times, there's some examples of like disasters I think would accelerate an arms race and just kind of drive us farther into it, and disasters that I think would sort of maybe lean us away from an arms race. But I do suspect that, honestly, so firmly, I'll end on this point. With regards to definitions for AGI, there's some really good ones. The whole OpenAI, like an AI system that can do essentially all current work, economically valuable work humans can do, and maybe all future economically valuable work humans can do. Like, that's good enough for AGI for me personally, but I'm firmly of the belief that for most people, like, they won't call it AGI until it pulls itself up by its own bootstraps and like starts building factories and like paving over people and like, like only then will they be like, it's AGI. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, I literally don't think it's a definition thing. I think it's a feeling thing. Do I feel like it's AGI yet? For most people, it's just feelings, and feelings don't get affected until you got 5 fingers, red, pop, red, like cartoon, bright red slapped on your face. I think most people just won't think it's AGI until then. And there's 10% of people that while they're getting consumed by the AGI, like in their final moments of death, they'll be like, but it's not even intelligent. Like, the 10% of people will say that too. So I don't think the definition things settle very much of anything. I think it's feelings. I think AGI is about feelings. Definitions are relatively nominal, in my opinion.
Thanks. Jerome?
Yeah, Elon Musk, as I mentioned, has been in favor of regulating future AGI longer than just about anybody else. And when he's been interviewed on that, I've caught him several times where he'll go like, yeah, I don't want regulation on this, but on this, it's different. This is different. And it's got to be internationally coordinated. And who's going to do that other than the UN? So we may be very lucky that Musk is with Trump at the moment. He may be a great asset there. So I'm hoping that and another thing that should be understood. So that's one approach. He also has 2 other backup approaches. One is the Neuralink. The idea is to merge the human mind through the brain and AI. So we evolved together. That's plan B. Plan C is his a way of grok. He believes that if you maximize and you know the direction of the stuff is to understand the universe. If that's the principal cardinal value, and we humans are part of that, then there's no reason for the AI to give the humans a hard time, just like there's no reason to give the stars a hard time, so to speak. So he's got 3 steps. You got regulation, you got merger, and you got what you're maximizing for. So he's very involved in this as much as anybody on the planet. So I'm glad he's there. I'm not crazy about other stuff, but that's another conversation for another day.
But do you think, Jerome, I mean, do you think he's going to stay there? So he was in the whole, like,
I hope so. I hope so. I hope so.
Again, when you're in the top 3 to make the sand god, you start your incentives start going different, right? You start saying, what if I can break through and build the thing that devours us, right? When you're the little guy, it's always virtuous to be like, yeah, slow down the big guys. But when you're one of the big guys, remember Robespierre, once he got his butt on the seat, just start chopping everybody else's head off, right? This is the way the game is played. And this it's just the game. I don't make the rules. It's just the game, right? So I fear Musk is close enough to his butt on the cushion where, like, he actually might just want to push forward. I don't know if he's going to be an ally in coordination.
But then look at these 2 other backup strategies. The motivation is we could lose control and lose the game, and that's why he has Plan B and Plan C. So I think his core knows the negative futures as well as anybody running around.
Oh, absolutely.
I think he's got that.
Altman realizes if he builds it first, it'll probably devour everybody. But if his only other choice is to have in his final moment the knowledge of his own defeat, that's not acceptable. Men of his stamp would rather have in their final moments the knowledge of their own triumph.
Well, let's create a self-fulfilling prophecy. The self-fulfilling prophecy is he's going to stick to his guns on regulation.
I'll cross my finger. I'm going to cross my fingers for. I'm not certain of where he's at, but I'm hoping that you are. It's all I'm saying. I'm just hoping.
He might be forced out. He's already got Steve Bannon gunning for him. Steve Bannon, the former chief advisor.
Steve Bannon also got fired from the White House last time.
Yeah. Patty, do you have any comments on either of these questions, or perhaps on the energy question, or anything else that caught your attention?
Regarding the energy question, there are arguments around it that AGI or an advanced AI before getting to AGI is going to be able to solve the climate change issues. So it's kind of a justification on okay, it's going to use a lot of resources, but it's also going to help to solve the issue after a while. So it's kind of a circular situation there. So yeah, I think that that's an argument that is worth it's worth to think about that, and what's the real possibility that AI is really going to help solve issues like climate change. And if so, then it would make sense that we are okay with the fact that it's using a lot of energy resources.
Thanks. Time, I think, for maybe 2 more questions, which I'm going to feed in now. One is by Manish Juneja, and he asks, might concerned citizens group together and vote with their feet? So if they find out that Samsung has too much AI of an unsafe kind in their washing machines, they could boycott Samsung products, or they might move away from a bank if they find out that the bank is using AI unwisely internally. Is that something we should be encouraging? And the other question I'm going to pick, so there's a whole bunch on the same level, I'm going to pick one by Peter Scott. He says, can't we learn from other industries where safety problems were solved, such as aircraft safety? Airplanes used to fall out of the sky, and they do so much less often these days. And he also mentions the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board. Again, road traffic is much safer than before. Isn't that a sufficient answer to the crisis ahead?
Yeah, I would like to talk about the one about citizens boycotting companies. From my personal opinion, I don't think I don't really think that's a powerful way of getting results out of a particular goal that a group of citizens, concerned citizens might have. I think that in this case, we really need to rely into all of these discussions that are being done at the government level, international organizations, and so on, to bring regulations into how the AI systems are being developed in a safe way. I don't know what Dan and Jerome feel about it, but I don't really think that boycotting is a very effective way to get really meaningful results towards a goal.
If the product was static, like a car or food, I can see the boycott working and has worked quite well. But the trouble is we're dealing with something that changes once it gets going pretty fast. So it could create completely different dynamics that what you're protesting against is no longer there. So by the time you get organized, it's sort of irrelevant. But I'd rather see people get organized to say, hey, start to do something. Don't just turn your back on these issues. That would be useful.
Yes, I agree with that.
I'm very much in agreement with our two other panelists here. I suspect that, well, number one, I don't think any of us should be that worried about washing machines or Samsung, to be honest. I think Samsung will be, around for a while, but I don't see Samsung hurling the sand god into the physical realm, in the next handful of months. I just don't see them in the runnings for that. So, I think that there's banal things, right? And I think there's forums to talk about banal things, and they matter, right? Like, ooh, is there privacy data my washing machine is taking because it's a smart washing machine? We could have made this meeting entirely about that, but I think this meeting was about like Paris is coming and like AGI is coming and what are we doing to prevent the arms race, like the questions that David asked us. For like your privacy data and your washing machine, I think maybe humans can do that. For ceasing a brute military and technological arms race to hurl post-human intelligence into the world before we understand it, I don't think that's sufficient. I also highly suspect that if any of these technologies are as useful as I suspect they'll be, like if I can click a button and I can have a dozen hyper brilliant marketing employees winning me as many sales calls as I want, I'm not gonna have a lot of power to not use that, right? Because everybody else will be. There won't be a lot of incentives to pull back from the expansion of agency and capability once the technology is actually there. Washing machine, different story. AGI, I think the incentives might lead us towards adoption. And I also think the concerns are just much bigger than the privacy data that your smart headset could pull out from your kid playing in the playroom next to you and listening to them on the microphone or whatever. Like, again, there's forums to discuss that. It's not an existential risk. And again, I don't think boycotting is going to skin the cat. I think hardcore limiting, at least for the time being, full embodiment, full agency of astronomically post-human intelligence systems is a much bigger sort of near-term concern, than washing machines.
Real quickly, Dan, you may have noticed that Max Tegmark his strategy, because he doesn't think the other stuff's working, is to say, we don't need AGI.
Yeah, I've heard it.
Advanced and narrow, we can do that marketing thing you just spent. We can do that. So
exactly.
all the stuff you're talking about,
exactly.
I think what it is, he figures we can't win the previous stuff. So he's just somebody say, don't worry about AGI. We don't need it. We can do this stuff.
Yeah, I want to hear out his logic there. I feel like the attractor state is developing products that like do the most stuff. And if I look at every industry I study, banking, life sciences, retail, whatever, the development of these products is always them doing more stuff. It's not like, right. More human having to babysit the tech, more babysitting is better. No. Once the performance is there, less babysitting is better. Subsuming more and more of the workflow, completely automated, way better than humans, more and more, that's where the value is, right? So I think there's an attractor state towards agency, pseudo agency emerging in all the use cases, the banal use cases that AI is being used in. So I don't know how he would stop those incentives and prevent them wholeheartedly. I would have to hear out his full position. The attractor state is too beefy. It's too beefy. The money's too much. It's too much.
Any thoughts on the question about can't we learn from industries which have solved safety issues, like airplanes, like road transport?
Airplanes don't rewrite their atomic code. Airplanes are not smarter than we are, to quote Eliezer. Yeah, yes, we can learn from all that, but we have to understand that the thing we're dealing with is much more difficult. We can learn from it, but we shouldn't copy it. Like it's very popular to talk about creating an international atomic energy agency for this stuff. And Eliezer Podolsky, as you know, has come out and said there's 17 reasons or 22 reasons why it's a different deal. We can start the conversation there, but it shouldn't end there, because what you're regulating is not a static thing like an aircraft engine.
So I'm sorry for the 14 questions we couldn't reach. I will make some of the questions available later, and there may be a broader conversation. In a moment, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give their closing remarks. We'll go to Patty and then Jerome and then Dan. But first, let me briefly talk about what's happening next with London Futurists, because we've had this session today, but what we're doing in 1 week's time from today, we have this session on the future of transhumanism. It's a bigger picture question, arguably, because a lot of the possibilities that AI enable are that we could ourselves become partially godlike or wholly godlike. Is that a good thing to talk about? Is transhumanism itself beyond its sell-by date, or is it still worth pursuing? So we are in London Futurists going to have a series of events on future scenarios for transhumanism, starting with Professor Stefan Lorenz Sorgner, who has written a lot about a type of transhumanism he calls Eurotranshumanism. He'll be here in 1 week's time. And looking further ahead, we're going to have episode 2 with Max Moore, who is arguably the founder of modern transhumanism since the 1990s. How has his ideas changed? He's going to be here in, but I forget, 6 weeks' time perhaps, or maybe more than 6 weeks. Anyway, you'll find the meetup page for Saturday the 15th of March once it gets published. So that's one series of events on the future of a philosophy. But there's another forthcoming series of London Futurist events which are looking at what are the root causes which are driving us in all our decisions. And Dan's already been talking about it today. We shouldn't just ask people to be good. We have to look at the environment which leads them to be good or bad by these judgments. So one possible bigger picture is philosophy, which we just talked about. Well, on the 15th of February, we're going to hear from Christian Rohn, who is a philosopher and entrepreneur. He's written a fascinating book called The Darwinian Trap: The Hidden Evolutionary Forces That Explain Our World and Threaten Our Future. He calls these forces Darwinian demons, but he also thinks we can engineer Darwinian angels, which is a transformation of the incentives under which we all operate, so that we're more concerned about reputation rather than just GDP. So that's on the 15th of February. And the final series of London Futurist events that I'll mention is when we get a chance to meet in the flesh, so to speak, in pubs, where we can actually touch each other or at least shake each other's hand as well as chatting. So this is going to be in a venerable pub in Fleet Street, 22 Ye Old Cock Tavern. Goes back 350 years or so, and we'll be discussing suggestions of implications from events in Paris, such as the AI summit, which will have happened by then, and also from Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, which I'll be visiting at the beginning of February, where they're having a very major healthcare summit looking at possibilities for reversing aging. So all that's ahead. Now we're going to come back to our 3 panelists, and they have a chance to highlight points they've already made or perhaps new points arising from the conversation. Let's hear first from Patty.
Yeah, sure. Well, really interesting questions, and the discussion with the panelists, it was amazing. Really looking forward to the Paris summit and what is going to come out of it. Actionable steps is what I think everyone wants to see. Like the declaration was a really nice output that we got from the UK one. And yeah, see not only how AI is being regulated in an horizontal way, but also because it's going through permeating everything, but also like the verticals, how it's going to be regulated, and thinking about how AGI or more advanced AI is going to affect healthcare, education, and military and so on. So really looking forward to that. And Dan, it's great that you're going to be there, and I'm going to be having a look at your social media and your website to see what are you going to report us back.
Thanks.
I put you on the
Jerome.
spot there.
Jerome, final comments?
Yeah, I put in the chat 2 reports. One, Work Technology 2050, that gets into the whole economic thing about the future of AI. And it's very detailed. It assesses like over 100 actions. It's very good. And then the other one, more recent, is the State of the Future report. It's got this 500 pages, 200 of those pages are dealing with AGI. And I would ask again, think about contracting your legislatures about creating a licensing system. It's going to take a while. They got to start now. And contacting your Minister of Foreign Affairs on getting a General Assembly of the UN to discuss these. If the world's got to discuss it, that's the best place to have a global discussion.
And if there is a licensing scheme, there has to be an enforcement scheme as well to stop people building AGIs without having permission.
Right.
Dan, final comments.
Yeah. I'm with Patty there. I think that coming out of Paris with some potentially Bletchley-esque degrees of steps will be great to see. I think there's an overt effort at this event to sort of put AI safety on the sidelines, but we do have Bengio presenting an AI risk report, which does talk a good deal about lack of control. And there will be some side events about AI safety. So I think I'm just really focused on trying to influence this event and the people there and the nodes there around safety, and hope some good things come of it. So I think there's some interesting thoughts here around sort of analogies with previous Cold Wars, and if maybe there's some stories we can tell about past successes that might inspire coordination and success in this future challenge. So Jerome, hopefully we'll riff on that later, but glad to be up here with you both. And David, I appreciate you hosting us.
It's my pleasure. Now, I need to apologize to everybody because somehow I haven't got the chat easily copyable or savable. I've obviously got the wrong setting here, but I'm going to keep the chat window open for quite a while. So those of you who want to stick around for a bit, you can wander up and down the chat and copy out the links for your own use. What's going to happen next? Well, we are at the end of the formal session, but I will keep the room open, and anybody who wants to stay, I will give a chance to chat a little bit more so you can dive into some of the topics that maybe we haven't fully discussed. The panelists will probably leave, they may leave, but if they want to stay a little bit, that will be great as well. But before we do the informal session, I'm going to insist that everybody stands up, walks around, has a bio break, gets a coffee. So we'll start that again in about 7 minutes for those who are still here. So thanks to everybody for making this thought-provoking conversation. It is a rich conversation, but we have to keep working at it. And gradually we will get a deeper understanding. We will have a credible path to licensing and enforcement. And we'll have a credible path that something like the vision of Max Tegmark is clear, how we can get true benefits from AI without wondering about AI trampling all over us and not being concerned about us. So let's figure that out. And thank you, everybody.